So welcome everybody. We're going to talk about a couple different permaculture principles, but we're mostly going to focus on food forests and how you can implement that in your own backyard. So we'll just get started. So a food forest is this idea that you're mimicking a forest environment, or specifically a forest edge environment, planted with primarily edible plants. And a forest edge is composed of different layers from top to bottom. You can think of it as having your larger overstory trees, some smaller trees, fruit-bearing, larger shrubs, smaller shrubs, down to your herbs and perennial ground covers. You've got your taller trees towards the back, and you've sort of got this gradation down out into the open, progressively allowing more and more sunlight to the different plants in the system. You can kind of imagine it as, depending on how complicated you want to make it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different layers from top to bottom. And like I said, different shrubs step further out into the sunshine depending on their need. And it can look a little busy, but ultimately this system can help a lot of these different plants to play off each other's needs, support each other's different soil requirements. And while it can be a little higher maintenance for the first year or two when you're implementing it or establishing it, ultimately it can create a very productive and very low maintenance self-maintaining ecosystem. It's this crazy idea that if we try to replicate systems that can maintain themselves in the wild, maybe we can get them to maintain themselves in our own yard. And so this is just an example of a lot of typical backyards in America. I'm sure a lot of you guys right now have this backyard. You've got your house, you've got your turf grass, maybe 1 or 2 trees, and that's about it. And so we're going to show you guys how to implement this in your own backyard in some simple ways that can be manageable for everyone. So I'll just go through a couple other quick sketches I did real fast to sort of explain this concept. So we're going to teach you guys today how to go from this, which I'm sure a lot of you have in your backyard, to something along these lines. And in America today, most people just don't know that there's better ways to maintain and manage and the opportunities to produce things in their backyard. You've got 3 or 4 trees, a big driveway, and turf grass from edge to edge. And so we will get started here. I think today we're going to start by explaining some of the concepts just by doing a little cross-section sketch, if you guys want to follow along. Imagine your own backyard, imagine existing trees, how much space you have. You can just use, crayons, colored pencils, markers, pens, whatever you have. I'm going to be using some pens and rendering markers. Don't feel bad if you don't have those. I use those in my program. It's just to help illustrate some of these concepts a little quicker. So we'll get started here. All right. I'm sure all of you guys in your backyard, if you do have a backyard, have at least some sort of existing trees. And a lot of people, when they think about redoing their backyard, they think they want a clean slate. They want to rip out their grass, rip out the trees, and just start new. But one thing that can be really beneficial about food forest design is actually incorporating a lot of the existing framework into the design. And that framework can be the house, it can be the fences, whatever is north facing, south facing, how tall it is. It can all contribute. You don't need to rip honestly, you don't need to rip anything out unless you absolutely have to. So let's say we have this existing overstory tree here. It can be if it's already there, don't feel bad about ripping it out. But if you're starting new, some species you can use that really are good in this situation could be honey locust. They allow a lot of dappled light through their overstory, which is beneficial to anything you plant underneath. A native example would be a big-tooth maple. Similar thing, they offer a lot of dappled lighting, and depending on the variety, can get quite tall and columnar, or short and shrubby, depending on your situation. But overall, this will most likely in your situation be what you already have to work with. And then under that, in a food forest, you want to add some smaller trees, maybe apple trees, fruit bearing. Maybe this is a little peach tree right here. We're just going to move quickly, so nothing fancy. Maybe in the back, you've got maybe a taller apple tree that you want to get established back here, fill in this space. And fruit trees come in a lot of different sizes. Most people tend to opt for dwarf varieties, just because they want it to fit into maybe a smaller space. But ultimately, fruit trees are actually pretty adaptable, and they can do pretty well no matter what situation you put them in. We're just gonna splash some color on here so we can see what the difference is here. While we're just throwing in some color here, put a thumbs up if you guys have your own backyard and if this is relevant to you. Oh, sweet, someone has a backyard. Perfect. And how many people have exclusively turf grass from fence to fence in your backyard? Be honest, it's okay. My parents do. I'm trying to change that. Oh, alrighty. Well, we're already a step in the right direction. And then after we implement some of those smaller fruit trees under our our larger existing trees, we can start to put in some of our larger shrubs. These can be currants or maybe even elderberries. You know, there's a lot of native examples that you can use. If you don't want to go native, you can do some different varieties of blackberries or raspberries, maybe in the back where you don't want their thorns to be an issue. Anything that'll fit underneath the story above without impeding the growth of either. Let's see, we'll just throw some color on there. And let's see.
Josh, we have a question.
Oh yeah, what's the question?
If you have fruit trees, room is needed to harvest the fruit. Are you leaving room for that? And then I had a personal question. What about sunlight getting in there?
Yeah, so great question. And we can visualize those concepts a little bit better when we go to plan view. And while this may look a little dense, maybe I'll just draw a quick sketch here. You've got your big existing tree right here, and then we're planting these smaller understory trees. And we do want to leave, you know, space or pathways in between. So we have our groupings of shrubs underneath here. If you guys can visualize this, and you can leave different spaces, you know, 6, 7, 8 feet wide, depending on how much room you have. But we're sort of clumping things, grouping them in 3s and 4s, leaving spaces in between where we can have our ground covers and our smaller perennials. And we can ultimately, if you really want to, do established paths to the back. But yes, you do want to leave space between different clumpings and groupings. It's not quite as evident in this plan view. And what was one of the other questions? I saw something about fruit trees. Oh, there's a lot of chat. Room is needed to harvest the fruit. Are you leaving room for that? Yes. And so wherever you want to plant trees, typically leave, you know, 3, 4, 5 feet in addition to what their maximum size is for that variety. Fruit trees do well in most situations. Yeah, so fruit trees are surprisingly drought tolerant. They will tolerate shade. They'll tolerate full sun. So yeah, a lot of people think that fruit varieties or different plants that produce, you know, vegetables can be pretty delicate. And while some can, depending on the situation, they actually can be quite resilient. So feel free to experiment. If something doesn't work, you know, then you can try something new. You know, plants are very adaptable. So after we get some of that mid-story larger shrubs, we can start to add some understory things, some of our maybe, you know, flowering perennials or grasses, maybe some ground cover strawberries, different herbs. You know, maybe we got some, look, there's some sage or some rosemary. Ultimately getting that gradation from our taller to our medium to our lower. And you can even bring it all the way out and then keep a lot of your turf grass. You know, it's a lot of people have kids. They like to have a space where they can, you know, gather, you know, play games. And so you really don't have to destroy your entire yard in order to create these new principles. You can implement them on existing frameworks and they can actually work really well. So sorry for the quick sketch, not the best. So yeah, that's how you can take it from, let me get this image again, from your existing just turf grass, maybe 1 or 2 trees and shrubs, to a food forest. And we're gonna do that concept again, but in plan view to help illustrate it a little bit better. Let's see. Hillary Sugar, great comment, Hillary. Let's see. Where did I just put that paper? Do you guys have any questions before we jump into plan view? Any comments? If I can find the papers I'm working with. Aha, here we go. Okay. Let's see. All right. So I'm sure a lot of backyards you've seen or that you've grown up in or that you currently have right now look like this on the left. And while that idea may work in some climates, obviously fence-to-fence turf grass in Utah is not the most sustainable. It utilizes a lot of water. It can be a lot to maintain, and it's not nearly as productive or productive at all. And there's a lot of alternative solutions without completely removing the purpose. So we're going to jump over to here. And so we have our backyard, and we thought, wow, I want to implement a food forest. How do I start, right? And so the first thing you can do is establish the area that you want to change. And like I said, turf grass is great in certain amounts, certain situations, especially if you have kids. So let's create an area where we want to preserve that grass. And that can help to inform the different spaces that we create, how large we want them to make them, and where we plant trees, how they can implement and interact with the existing framework, the fence, the house. This is a really dead marker. But it works. Okay, so we've established where we want to keep our turf grass. It's nice to keep it in the center, in an open space. It's sort of that taking the place of that meadow that the edge of the forest is transitioning down into. But in this case, it's that all-American backyard gathering area. All right, and so then we've got our existing trees. Maybe it's a large pine or a honey locust, or a maple, or maybe you don't even know what it is, but it's there and it's large and you don't want to pull it out. That's great. We like shade. Mature trees, too often are ripped out prematurely without much thought, and they can really contribute to a space and to a food forest. So like we showed in our plan view, we want to go ahead and add in some smaller understory trees. And thank you for the comment about access. So maybe we only want to add a few under here, leave some space that we can get to them. Let's maybe go in and add a smaller tree under this guy, maybe one over here. And then we've got this dead space over here, so maybe we want to plant a new overstory tree that will mature in, however many years it takes. And then we can really cultivate a unique relationship between some of the larger and smaller trees. And it's great to group trees in odd numbers. As far as design principles, it can look better. It utilizes space better, and they can play off each other in their growth habits. And so don't worry about necessarily how many and where. Again, it's all up to your own experimentation. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, it's all dependent on how your own backyard works, how many mature trees there are. So don't feel like you have to do anything ultra specific. So let's add some color on there. Feel free to.
So Josh, somebody.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Somebody specifically asked about flowering pear trees. They're saying that that's what they have mostly in their yard, and they're asking if you can work with that. And then something I think that might be important is the size of your circles there. That's their mature growth size, correct?
Yes.
Relative to your
stage?
So
that's a great point. So in this example I'm using, at least, we're assuming that this is an established house with established trees. But if you don't have established trees, you can, at any point in the life cycle of these species, you can go ahead and plant them. Again, the end result will be a little different, or it may take a little longer. But again, this sort of system, the idea is that it's adaptable, it's changeable, it's malleable, and they'll learn to interact with each other. Is that what you're asking? Let's see.
Just as far as spacing goes between them, because your circles are touching each other. So
yeah.
that's maximum mature size that they'll get. So for however many years until it reaches that point, you'll have lots and lots of space. But then when they're
Yeah.
all the way mature, then you'll have a little bit of space.
Yes,
Excellent
point. Yep, thank you. So yeah, so just to reiterate Lacey's point, at least in this example, to explain these concepts, we're showing these at mature size where there's a little bit of overlap between different species. Ultimately, when you plant a new apple tree, it's going to be this big. You know, it's going to be a small little stick that you got at Home Depot if that's where you got it. Let's see. Can you work with flowering pear trees? Yeah, you know, any overstory trees. Flowering pear are a small to mid-sized tree, and so they can work as both a understory tree or as a shade tree. They can be adaptable depending on the situation. So yeah, any existing framework you can work with. Which direction is the sun coming from in your picture? Let's say it's coming this way. And so that'll help to inform where we want to put our let's pull this guy back out. That'll help to inform how we want to place our different trees and our understory shrubs. And so if the sun is coming this way, maybe we want to focus more on having our, our smaller fruit trees we're adding maybe on this side. So maybe that wasn't the best idea. How about we say the sun's coming from, you know what, we'll just say it's coming from this way. But yeah, great question. Depending on where the sun is coming from, you're gonna wanna focus your efforts on creating that gradation in the direction of the sun. All right, let's throw some color on here just to make it look.
Josh, just to one quick question about water, just because like down here in Moab, we have 9.5 inches of rain a year. And
yeah,
are you looking at, if you have taken out the grass, then those trees would be on the pre-existing irrigation system, or how are you envisioning, you might be getting to this, but just so I can understand the earthwork behind these food forest designs.
Yeah. So I was going to touch on irrigation a little later on, but that is a great point. And so depending on your budget or your resources, you can plant on your existing irrigation framework. If you want a more sustainable solution that uses less water, you can redo your irrigation, maintain your traditional lawn watering system here, but you can do a network of drip irrigation underneath your garden beds. Depending on if you're in Logan or Moab, those needs are going to be a little bit different. But one of the beneficial things of a food forest is that because it is creating that network of canopies at different levels, you do tend to maintain a higher soil moisture. And so once established, typically there is less irrigation. When you've got a big open lawn like this, there's a lot of evaporation, there's a lot of direct sunlight. But once you start to implement some of these solutions, ultimately, and ideally there is less irrigation needs. But again, that'll depend on your climate and your budget and your resources.
So just real quick, one last thing. So right against the house, the tree that is against the house there, you put fruit trees on the right side. If the sun's coming from the left, maybe those would be trees that prefer partial shade, or would those still be full sun varieties that you have in the rest of the design? Because those would see more shade if the sun is coming from that left-hand side.
Yeah, no, excellent point. Excellent point. Whatever direction the sun is coming on, trees or shrubs that require more sun, you're going to want them on the south side. South side, for those of you who don't know quite as much about sun needs for plants, you're going to want to plant your highest sun need on the south side of trees or buildings or fences, and things that require total shade or partial shade, generally speaking, you're going to want them on the north side. So great point, Rosalind. I should have laid this example out a little bit better. So, but good point. Let's see. Any other questions before we keep going? Let's just get splash some color on here so we can see what we're working with. So yeah, so in that case, we're going to want these are probably going to be some more sun needy plants. These are going to be some more shade needy plants. And then one concept that I wanted to discuss before moving on, I should have discussed it before jumping into this. Give a thumbs up if you guys know much about hugelkultur. Hillary, thank you for the comments about sun exposure. I appreciate it. Oh, great, we got someone. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what hugelkultur is, it's this permaculture concept where you are creating mounds and trenches in the landscape. You fill them with various size sticks, twigs, and logs that decompose at different rates over the years, creating this nutrient-rich, sort of dense sponge that maintains moisture, it maintains nutrients, higher concentration of bacteria and fungi that help to create different soil networks. And by planting different trees, shrubs, plants, perennials around the system, they tap into this this sponge, if we want to use that word. And it works really well in climates in Utah that are typically drier. A lot of species have been shown to maintain growth in dry spells without supplemental irrigation, simply by the fact that these systems can maintain higher soil moisture. They can help to kickstart the growth of soil systems. And if you want to see some examples of these, the internet is a great resource. We have some in the Logan Permaculture Garden, and they're a great way to help establish food forest systems like the one that we're designing. So let's go ahead and say that we're going to put a hugelkultur mound, maybe wrapping through here. Typically, you want to have them on contour. Meaning that if the water is sloping off the ground this way, we want to face our mounds perpendicular to the slope so that our mound is catching as much moisture as possible, to help maintain the soil moisture, kickstart the decomposition of the various sticks, twigs, and logs that we put in that trench. And it can really help to establish those systems and connections between the plants, the animals, the bacteria in the soil, the fungi, cyanobacteria, all those fun connections that we love to implement. So let's go ahead and maybe denote those with some brown here. And so, yeah, so we want to make sure that we're planting among those. They can be very discreet in the ground. You can plant on top of them. You can use them as pathways themselves, with plants grown around them. They're very adaptable. All right, so we got our understory trees, and I should have specified the process of designing a food forest. You're wanting to do your earthworks first, identifying where you're going to keep your existing turf grass and framework, where you're going to have your beds, what those irrigation needs are, where you're going to put your hugelkultur mounds and different earth movements such as that, and then jump into planting. So Roz, thank you for pointing that out. I got ahead of myself. But anyways, back to plant species and plants. So we've got our understory trees. Now we're going to want to put maybe some smaller shrubs like currants or elderberries. Maybe we want to put some blackberries or raspberries, thorny things along the back here where they're going to be out of the way. Plants that spread, you want to maybe have them sort of on their own where they're not going to interact or take over quite as much. Maybe let's add a grouping of some smaller shrubs here on this, what is now east-facing side. Let's see. Maybe if we have some more shade-tolerant ones, we can put them on the north side of this guy over here. And if you're wondering about resources to, obtain plants or what plants to plant, again, the internet is a fantastic resource. There's lots of YouTube channels and YouTube videos talking about permaculture principles, tons of websites. USU, the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, has some amazing publications on their website, and some books as well that I can go over at the end here. So yeah, and maybe if we want to, if this is south-facing, maybe we decided, maybe we do want a traditional box garden, maximize sunlight for our summer veggies. So let's just throw some in there. Let's get some pathways going through here. Again, this is a very, very quick sketch, very conceptual approach. However you want to approach your own space is ultimately up to you, and what you want to prioritize, things that you're going to be doing in those spaces, and what you want to produce. Let's
so Josh,
see.
why did you put the raised beds, the vegetable beds, close to the house? Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, so the argument of putting your summer annual vegetables on the south facing side is a lot of them require full sun, and you're maximizing the amount of reflective heat off of the building in the early spring months and the later fall months to maybe kickstart growth, maintain heat in the soil. And this area, we have less shade from our trees, and so you're maximizing that sun exposure. And as far as a design point, you're keeping the the man-made built objects out of view, and you're in the sort of the natural landscape this way. And then, Roslyn, if I miss the point you're trying to make, feel free to jump in. But that is at least my validation.
It's a really good application of zones. So that's a zone 1 example right there, with more intensive plants closer to your house where you're more likely to see them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And for those of you who don't know much about zone concepts, it's the idea that zone 1 is your most intensive area close to the house where, you're cooking, and then suddenly, oh my gosh, I need Roma tomatoes right now. And then you can just run out, grab them. It's the plants with the highest need and maintenance, so that they're constantly getting the attention they need. You don't want to have your vegetables hidden in the back corner where you can't see them. And then, you haven't gone out there for a day or two and you realized, oh no, I forgot to water them and now they're dead. And so there's a lot of reasons for having your vegetables in your zone 1 closest to the house. But ultimately, you want to have your highest, most intensive, most productive, and most need in your zone 1. Let's throw some color on there just to differentiate. Sorry, I'm having trouble multitasking, checking the chat and drawing. Let me check the chat right now. Do you actually need to dig down at all for a hydroculture? Not necessarily. In wetter climates, you do. In drier climates such as Utah, it is more beneficial because you do tend to maintain a higher soil moisture, and you can help to start the decomposition of the organic materials faster and quicker. Let's see. Wheelchair accessible fruit trees resource. Oh, that is a great resource. Thank you, Lacey. Do you recommend specific tree guilds? Roslyn, if you want to jump in and answer that question, I'm not quite as knowledgeable on tree guilds, unless anyone wants to make a comment on that.
Yeah, I can put a couple resources in the chat if I get a chance. I am recording this call, so we'll see if I'm able to do that. If not, maybe Hillary or Lacey would be willing to put a resource or 2 in there. There's lots of great examples of guilds that are effective online.
Yeah, great questions, everybody. Let's see. I was wondering about having mounds. It seems like the water would flow off the mound, leaving dryness on top. Again, it depends on the climate or the sun exposure, but generally speaking, you're wanting the moisture to be in the ground within the mound, not necessarily on top. And so, yeah, in a rain event, water is going to flow off the top, but ultimately it'll be maintained and concentrated within the decomposing organic matter in the below ground trenches. The idea is that whatever you plant on, near, or around it, their root systems will dig down and attach themselves into that system. And so it's not as much about maintaining moisture on the top of the mound, it's about maintaining moisture within the mound. But great questions. Yes, there'll be a recording available. It'll be posted on YouTube afterward. Let's see. Do you need specific plants for different trees? It depends on the tree, not necessarily. But generally speaking, there are some trees that may require higher levels of nitrogen or different nutrients in the soil. And there's a lot of resources online that can show you what shrubs or perennials or ground covers to plant underneath the trees to help maintain the different soil compositions that maybe that fruit tree prefers. There's a lot of different variables, a lot of different things that can go into it, but depending on what you have growing already and what you want to add, that'll influence those decisions. And again, there's a lot of online resources that you can check out to help explain some of those more specific concepts. Ground covers, yep. So now that we've gotten some of our smaller shrubs and hills, let's get to edges of this system. Mint is a great thing that is producing fruit. And if you want maybe to add of a, aesthetic element, you can also add some native bunch grasses to add some, on a forest edge, they're typically transitioning into a meadow with lots of grasses. So that's a great way to help maintain that ecosystem, mimic what would actually be happening. Natural environment, they will use sort of natural to help the amount of seed. There's no exception that your vegetable garden has to be in its own little box in its own little area, but ultimately, if there's enough sun, enough exposure, and it's getting enough water, you can really plant a lot of your annual vegetables anywhere in your garden. Again, it just depends on the specific needs and specific factors that influence your backyard or your garden. So let's throw some color on here. Again, this is a really rough sketch. You'll probably want to plan it out a little bit more specifically in your backyard. Let's see. Do having vines growing into the trees ever damage the trees? At least with annual vegetables, if it's maybe cucumber or squash, typically no, because by the time annual vines, such as cucumber, squash, start to get their rapid growth by August and September, a lot of the trees and shrubs have already established their annual growth back in May, June, and July. And so that 2 months at the end of the season really won't harm them. However, if you're doing perennial vines or woody vines such as grapes, you just want to be careful with having them growing into your existing trees because they can choke them out. So just depending on the species and the situation, just be aware of that. Wouldn't the tree shade the cucumbers from the sun? If it is on the north side, then yes, but if the sun is coming from the south and say you planted some cucumbers on this south side, they're growing up, typically they'll maintain enough enough sun exposure that they'll be able to grow adequately. But that is a good point. So just be aware of where you're planting, how big the shade outreach of your mature or story trees are. Let's see, any other questions? Hillary made a great point about cultivating. Yes, it does need a few years for the wood in the trench to really serve as a water sponge. Depending on what is planted, most likely will require some supplemental watering, especially in the top drier zone. Great point. And that's another reason when you do implement a cultivator mound, you want to fill it with just as many leaves and twigs as you do large logs, because that way in the first and second season, those leaves and twigs are going to be the first to decompose and can kickstart that process and can help to decompose some of the larger material. So you really want to have that variety of size and variety of material. I'm curious about working a Wallapini into a permaculture design and if it has ever been done before. Aurelia Saunders, could you please explain what a Wallapini is? I've never heard of that before, but it's a good question.
So a Wallapini is basically a greenhouse that you berm up a lot of dirt and such on one side, at least, so that you have like the main sunlight coming into the greenhouse from one side, and then dirt helping to insulate it throughout the year. So sometimes it's sunken into the ground, and sometimes you just build onto one side with dirt, depending.
Gotcha. Okay, that's a fascinating concept. Could you maybe post a link about it that some people could reach out to, and even I could check it out? If you don't have time, it's all right. But yeah, that's a great concept. Thank you for bringing that up. And then ultimately, another thing that I am a big champion of, there's no reason that this can't look pretty. A lot of naysayers of permaculture say it can look wild, but if you maintain it, if you trim things back, if you maybe add some perennial flowers to add some color, ultimately it can be a really beautiful design. Once you get the framework for the species that are producing, you can really start to play around with it, add in things here and there, see what works, see what doesn't work. And again, there's no set hard yes or no on what to do. There's definitely some base principles that you want to take into account, sun exposure, climate, soil moisture, what species play with what species. But again, experiment, figure out what works in your yard and have fun with it. One more concept that I wanted to touch on that I've actually been really gung-ho about lately. Give a thumbs up if you guys know what a ribbon driveway is. Let's see, I'm in the chat, let me go back. So a ribbon driveway, for the first half of the 20th century, was near universal for garages. And the last half of the 20th century, we just went to full concrete. But a ribbon driveway is this idea that you've got two concrete strips separated by plantings on either side or in the middle, or just exposed dirt. And if you've got a single driveway or a single garage, it can work great. And it's cost effective. You know, you're using a third the amount of concrete, but what's great about it is you can maximize the amount of permeable surfaces. You can plant maybe some fun ground covers in here, maybe some grasses. Again, not necessarily related to food forest design, but, you know, just a fun principle if you want to really decrease the amount of impervious surfaces on your property. And they look gorgeous. You can look at pictures of them. You know, you see them a lot in older neighborhoods, older houses, but they're really fun. They're really productive, and they're really great at preventing the amount of runoff from your property. Because, I mean, right there, we just decrease the amount of runoff from the roof and the driveway by, you know, I would argue, you know, a fourth or maybe even a third, depending on how big your driveway is. So that's just a fun concept. So yeah, that is how to turn your backyard from this to a food forest. And, you know, it may look pretty expensive, all those different plants, but it doesn't happen in a day. It, you know, takes quite a few years to implement these solutions and these connections between these different species. You can get different tree varieties from your local nursery, and honestly, a great way to get plants and starts is honestly just asking your friends, asking your neighbors. You know, I know that I have raspberries, and they go insane every year, and I'm always giving them away. You know, if your neighbor has some beautiful irises, you know, just go over and ask, hey, could I take a start of that? Or could I take a cutting of your currant? You know, it's actually quite easy to propagate on your own. And ultimately that can save you a lot of time and a lot of money. Let's see. Let's go to the comments. Thank you for the Wallapini ribbon driveway. Yes, keep the water in your own ground and off of the gutter stormwater runoff. USU Logan has a food forest garden you can tour with different zones. Google USU Permaculture Garden. Yeah, everybody visit the Permaculture Garden on campus. You can see a lot of these principles in action in a relatively mature state. Cheryl says, would you help redesign my yard to permaculture? Totally. Message me after this. Hillary Shugart says, propagation by division, cutting seeds. Yes, you know, there's a lot of different ways to propagate. And, you know, with a little bit of quick education on your own, it's relatively easy to do. A great resource I like to use, this is from the Center for Water Efficient Landscaping, is the Combinations for Conservation. While not necessarily specific to food forest design, they've got a lot of, let's see if I can, oh gosh, look this up. They've got a lot of different species, native and climate adaptive. They've got really unique ways of explaining how they can interact with the existing landscape, what the requirements are, what their benefits are, how to plant them with each other, what goes well together. And really, it's a great resource. You know, I use this a lot in my design work. And even though permaculture isn't really ever mentioned specifically, there's a lot of principles that are emulated here. And again, internet is a fantastic resource, but I would really recommend getting this book, Combinations for Conservation. It implements a lot of solutions from food forest design without ever mentioning food forest specifically. And so again, this right here is the plan view of a food forest, and this right here is the section view of a food forest. Just to reiterate, if you guys are jumping in and you missed the beginning part, which I believe some of you did, you've got those different layers of from your larger overstory trees to your intermediary smaller trees that may be you know, apple or fruit or peach or, you know, something along those lines. Your larger shrubs, smaller shrubs and perennials down to your ground covers. And then if you have a grass lawn, there's no reason to rip it all out. You know, keep the space you need, and that can actually help to, you know, visually guide from that, you know, meadow ecosystem up into that food forest. So yeah, and ultimately, you know, take the guiding principles and run with it, and whatever works in your own yard, that's great. You know, experiment. This is sort of a long-term solution. You know, after a few years of effort, you can really start to see it hold its own, maintain itself. You'll see less weeding, less water consumption, less maintenance, and you know you're doing something right when plants start to evolve and appear elsewhere and migrate, because that means they're happy, you know, they love the system you've created. And plants moving around, at least in my opinion, is not a bad thing. Let's see, any more questions? Yep.
One person asked about Utah specific examples of guilds, and one resource that might be helpful, I shared with you, down in Moab, we have a website called beinspired.usu.edu. It's part of the USU Permaculture Initiative, but it's a spin-off at the community level of the gardens we've put in. There's a permaculture tab on that website. So if you went to beinspired.usu.edu, and in the permaculture tab, there's the design plans for USU Moab. So there's the plant palette, and then there's also a map and a key about all the plants we planted at USU Moab. Why that might be helpful is that we have an overstory that is shade producing, and we also have a fruit producing overstory, and then all of the plants on the planting list were designed and included with the intention of performing a functional ecosystem. So soil stabilizing grasses, and then nitrogen fixing plants, pollinator attracting plants, and nutrient accumulating plants. And so those are all working together as a guild, and those design plans might be helpful for people for a few Utah specific examples, especially in an area that receives under 10 inches of rain a year as we do down here.
Yes, great. No, thank you, Rosalind. You guys for all the comments and resources. I'm just going to run through these real fast. Key concept group by water needs. Great point, Hillary. You're going to want to group your species by higher water needs. You're going to want to group those together. That's part of the concept of creating zones, is that you can have areas that you water more regularly and areas that you water less or maybe not at all. And so it's important to group species together with similar water needs. Let's see, I got the question about the guilds. How does underplanting fruit trees work with mature giant elms? Again, typically speaking, you're going to want to plant them on the south side of the elm. And depending on the fruit variety or the shade tolerance, you're just going to want to do a little bit more research into what species of tree would work in that specific situation. But I'm a firm believer that there's always something that can work somewhere. You just might have to do a little bit of research. Hillary made a great point that a lawn serves as a fire break, it's a play surface, and it also has a cooling effect through evapotranspiration. Less lawn can be good and more food, but lawn is not always bad. We tend to villainize grass lawns when we're talking about water conservation, but in moderation, anything can have a benefit. We have large pine trees that drip sap and needles onto everything. What plants work with them? I'm not an expert on how mature pine droppings can affect the soil composition and what plant species can go in them. Rosalind, if you want to chime in, but again, there's tons of resources online that can help to explain a lot of that. USU has a bunch of resources, and just similar to the different posts that Lacey and Rosalind have been posting. There are edibles that grow in shade. Yep, there's edibles that grow in shade, edibles that grow in sun. Just gonna find what works for your space. Any more comments or questions?
Josh, someone asked about permaculture versus hugelculture. Maybe you could cover that. I zoned out for a second, but I think.
So, which is a form of permaculture, is an overarching term that means your mimictivity soil and the local ecosystem and environment, with an emphasis on food production. And that's the overarching term. And food forest is a principle of permaculture, and hugelculture is also a principle of permaculture, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of other principles that we could get into, but I don't believe we have the time today. If there's no more questions, thank you guys all for coming today. Rosalind, Lacey, Hillary, thank you for chiming in with some of the more detailed principles. I approach permaculture from a design perspective, and I think that ultimately there's no reason that permaculture can't look beautiful. And so I believe, with good design and good planning, you can make any solution work. And so thank you for all your help and resources, all you, even some of your visitors chiming in. It's been great. And, permaculture, everyone has their own approach, everyone has their own ideas and experiences, and ultimately bringing those together and sharing them is what can move this movement forward. So thank you guys again. Oh, Elaine said, are there swells on either side of the mounds? Depending on how much space you have, there can be or there can't be. Swells will help to, in a rain event, maintain the water on the site so it can percolate down and maybe have a higher concentration of soil moisture. But again, just depending on the space or the situation, you can have them, but they are not necessary. Any last minute questions? You guys have been great today. Thank you for all the comments.